Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Qur'anites.com. Today is Tuesday the 15th of May 2018, and today I want to look at the question of Sunnah, or the word Sunnah, more specifically the expression the Sunnah of God in the Qur'an. And there's a very specific reason for this, because Sunnah, if you come from an Islamic background, a Muslim background, or if you've entered into the religion of what I call brand Islam, then Sunnah, the word Sunnah is something you're going to be, you're going to have sort of thrown at you morning, noon and night. It is something of a trigger word for the traditionalist, and by it he means something in addition to the Qur'an. He means something other than the Qur'an, something never read by or agreed by or required by the Prophet Muhammad. But that's not really what I'm going to concentrate on in terms of, of this talk. What this talk is really to do with what the Qur'an means by it. And the one thing that all Muslims of whatever stripe agree upon is the Qur'an. So surely it should be of some interest what the Qur'an means by the word Sunnah, and more specifically the Sunnah of God. Now, without going into the details at this point, there are a couple of verses which in the Qur'an which suggest that the messenger is to purify the believers, but that's entirely consonant with his passing to them the message which he received. Leaving that to one side for the moment, nowhere in the Qur'an does it say, you, Muhammad, devised a lot of teachings of your own in addition to this Qur'an. Quite the opposite. And the traditionalist knows this. When I'm saying traditionalists, I'm talking about the apologists for the Sunni mainstream points of view. They're not stupid men. They do know the Qur'an, and they know this is the case. Now, certainly the Qur'an says to believe in God and the messenger. And this is a general instruction. We are to believe in all messengers. If you recall the instance with, I think it's Surah 5, where Isa ibn Maryam is with his disciples, and they're saying that we have believed in God and they've believed in the messenger. They've followed the messenger. Well, who are they talking about? Are they talking about Muhammad? No, of course not. In the context, they're talking about the messenger to them at that time, who was Isa. So that's a general instruction, and one can argue the finer points of that again. But as I say, we're going to get into this question of Sunnah, this word which, as I say, is something of a trigger word, and it becomes something of a trigger word if you take the Qur'anite position, because you hear it so many times, and it's so difficult because you're dealing with people who have assumed their conclusions, and there's so much unpicking to do that it becomes quite, you need a lot of patience, and it's not really that productive. But again, I think the thing we can all agree upon is that the Qur'an is from God. It is perfect. It is, it is the message of Muhammad that he delivered to all mankind. And I think we can also agree that the Sunnah of God, should we find out what it is, should take precedence to any other kind of Sunnah, and that's really what this is about. So, also of note, people forget that the messenger of called Muhammad is dead, as we read at 314, and Muhammad is only a messenger. Messengers have come and gone before him. If then he dies or is killed, will you turn back on your heels? And he who turns back on his heels does no harm to God at all. That's at 314. Now, obviously, the traditionalist has created and now takes in derogation to the Qur'an an entire literature. He has done what the children of Israel did with Musa before, and I refer you to Al-Baqarah, the second surah, verses 67 through 71, where if you know the Qur'an well, you'll recall that this is where the children of Israel are instructed, given a very simple instruction, just simply to kill a cow, to kill a heifer, to sacrifice a heifer. And it's, well, how should we do it? Is it this one? Is it a yellow one? Is it this kind of hue? And just do. And Musa is told to tell them, just do what you're told. And this kind of, hair splitting is something which, we find repeated. The Qur'an really just gives us sort of character types, archetypes, and this archetype is something which we find, with us to this day. How do you pray? As I say to people, how do you cut the grass? I don't know. Anyway, this usurping literature, written centuries after the life of the Prophet, is ascribed to Muhammad, and it serves to insulate and isolate the believer from the revelation that Muhammad received. And here we find at 6:112 through 117 the following: "And we appoint for every prophet an enemy, shaitans of men and jinn, instructing one another in the decoration of speech by deception." So, without taking the example of the Prophet Muhammad, let's take the Prophet Jesus. Now, Muslims all accept that Jesus is a prophet, and what we find in his revelation is that his message is completely usurped by Paul, by somebody who never met him. Now, in the Muslim tradition, the Qur'an was fixed at the time. Irrespective of what the traditionalist claims, the Qur'an itself claims to have been written down at the time on pure sheets of paper, of parchment. It was written on parchment at the time, not scraps of, some sort of the shoulder bone of an ass and the jawbone of something or other, and scrabbling around on pieces. No, that's not according to the Qur'an. I mean, if you don't accept the Qur'an, fine, go and do something else. But if one is to accept it, and if one is to credit it with being what it claims to be, then that is what it claims, and that's in complete contradiction, actually, or completely contradicted by this hadith literature. Now, if we are to criticize the Talmudic Jew for usurping the Torah on the basis of later writings, then there is reason to stop and consider if Muslims have not committed the same basic error. We find at 62:5, "The example of those given to bear the Torah, then have borne it not, is like the example of the donkey bearing books. Evil is the example of the people who repudiate the proofs of God, and God guides not the wrongdoing people." Now, as I say, you will hear the word Sunnah from the traditionalist ad nauseum, and the implication is that if you do not agree to have your intelligence and reason cauterized and insert into the resulting whole a literature entirely extraneous to the Qur'an, you're somehow being disloyal to the messenger. That following the messenger naturally is synonymous with replacing your adherence to the Qur'an with a mountain of other books. So let's look at the word Sunnah. The word Sunnah in Arabic, the plural sunan. It means an established way of doing things, an established practice, a practice. And in Arabic, it means a mode or method of treatment or way of doing things or living, and is a word one hears, as I say, ad nauseum for those who've fallen for the traditionalists' bait and switch maneuver, i.e. supplanting the Qur'an by an entirely different literature, one which I'm sure you know if you listen to this channel, was written down hundreds of years later. And by this word, such people mean a fluid, arbitrary subset of the broader literature which they prefer to follow over the Qur'an, which takes as its focus actions ascribed to Muhammad, many of which contradict both the spirit and the letter of the Qur'an. So, what about the word Sunnah as it occurs in the Qur'an? It occurs 16 times in the Qur'an, and I will list all of the references in the drop down below. Now, in none of those cases in which the word Sunnah occurs in the Qur'an does it signify actions habitually performed by any prophet. I'm talking here about actions in the sense of how they dressed and how they conducted themselves, etc. And in no instance does it reference Muhammad's personal habits or preferences or him as an individual, ever. And this is a verifiable fact. And I encourage you too. All you have to do is look at these references and go through whatever translation you like, and you'll find that that's the case. Typically, the word sunnah as used by the Qur'an, and this should interest us, if Muslims, the one thing that they all agree upon, that everybody agrees upon, is the Qur'an, right? So in this case, given that sunnah is such it's been elevated to the level of the Qur'an and the sunnah, this word has taken on it's been put on a par with the Qur'an. It should be of some interest to us what the Qur'an means by this word. Typically, out of these 16 cases, about half relate to previous peoples, and it talks about the previous peoples and their practice and what they did and what happened to them. Typically, in the context of them being warned by a messenger, typically though not always rejecting that warning, and then being destroyed. That's kind of it. But in 7 cases we find the expression the Sunnah of God, and in 1 case we find our Sunnah, as in our relating to God, so God's Sunnah. So surely we should be interested in the Sunnah of God. Whatever one means about Sunnah in other cases, surely the Sunnah of God should take precedence over anything else if we take the Qur'an seriously. So I'm going to go through now and look at each of those cases where this occurs in a context. So it's not just going to be that little, that line, but in the broader context. As you are invited to, you may download my work, The Qur'an, A Complete Revelation, which is 536,000 words. It includes a complete translation of the Qur'an, and in all cases where the word sunnah occurs in that translation, it's footnoted, referenced, and you may download it for free from Qur'anite.com. So the first instance I'm going to read is at 73 through 77. And we read, "And they would seduce thee away from what we instructed thee, that thou invent about us other than it. And then would they take thee as a friend." I'm just going to pause there for a second. Think about that. If you think about the amount of people that only when they have something other than it, other than the Qur'an, are they take you as a friend. But if you don't subscribe to that, if you don't subscribe to this other thing, this thing other than what are we talking about here? Sunni, Shias, doesn't matter. The only thing we know that Muhammad received is the Qur'an, and if you hold to that alone, they won't take you as a friend, as I'm sure many people watching this channel have experienced. And I'll continue. "And were it not that we had made thee firm, thou wouldst have inclined towards them a little. Then would we make thee taste double in life and double in death." So the messenger himself would have been doubly punished in this life and in the life to come had he succumbed to those kinds of pressures. To continue. "Then hadst thou found no helper against us. And they would draw thee out of the land to turn thee out therefrom, and then would they not tarry after thee save a little." And the reason is because once that's happened, and then the punishments of God become binding. This is a motif we find through the Qur'an, runs through it like Brighton through a stick of Brighton rock. To continue, the sunnah of those we have sent down before thee of our messengers. And here I perceive an ellipsis has not changed, and the reason is, as we'll see, because this is a repeated motif in the Qur'an, and we'll get to these as we go through, to continue. And thou wilt not find to our practice, to our sunnah, we're talking God speaking here, to the sunnah of God, any alteration. Now that's 1773 through 77. So the key takeaway here is that the sunnah of God does not change. Okay? Now, the messenger's job is to deliver the message no matter what, as we've just seen. And this pretty much deals with the dominant concerns of the so-called Sunni schools. And they would seduce thee away from what we instructed thee. And this is the Qur'an. That thou invent about us other than it, and then would they take thee as a friend. Now, if this doesn't describe, the Sunni position and what they claim, then I find it quite hard to imagine one that does. We'll look at the next instance, and this is found at 33, 38 through 40. There is no distress upon the Prophet concerning what God ordained for him. The practice of God, the Sunnah of God, among those who came and went before, and the command of God is a destiny decreed, those who conveyed the messages of God and feared him and feared not anyone save God. Again, ellipsis, has not changed, and we'll get into why further on. And sufficient was God as a reckoner. This relates to the conveying of messages and then the destruction. But I'll continue. Muhammad is not the father of any one of your men, but the messenger of God and the seal of the prophets, and God is knowing of all things. That's 33, 38 through 40. Now, this section pretty much deals with the dominant concerns of the so-called Shia schools, which, obviously Muhammad, they can't argue that he had a son, but that you've basically got you've got a schism, an essential schism. One is that there is one way of understanding what God wants after the Qur'an, and this is to do with this literature invented. This is the Sunni school. And the other school is the Shia school, which is fundamentally that there's a human being, some sort of descendant who has a right to dictate what the ummah, whatever we mean by that, should be doing. And this is the Shia school. These two sections fundamentally dispatch both of those. And nowhere in the Qur'an, this is an indisputable fact, nowhere in the Qur'an is there anywhere where any kind of inheritance or where there's any provision for what should happen after Muhammad, which is quite a big, if that's a mistake, that's a big oversight. If I just back up a little bit, and Muhammad is only a messenger. Messengers have come and gone before him. If then he dies or is killed, will you turn back on your heels? Will you go back to inventing stories and so on? And he who turns back on his heels does no harm to God at all. That's 314. So neither of these are confirmed by the Qur'an. What we do have is we have the message that Muhammad was given, and actually it's left to us to make sense of that using our intelligence. I know it's a radical thought, but there you are. So again, just clearing up this 33, 38 through 40, Muhammad is not the father of any one of your men, but is the messenger of God and the seal of the prophets. So there isn't, there are no hidden imams or, anything like this. Anyway, we'll get into the next one. This is found at 33, 62 through 68. The practice of God, the Sunnah of God, among those who came and went before, and here I perceive an ellipsis, has not changed. And thou wilt not find for the practice of God any replacement. There's no replacement for it. No hidden imams, no invented literatures, nothing like that. That's interesting. And it continues. The people ask thee about the hour, i.e., the final hour. Say thou that the knowledge thereof is but with God. Unlike in the Hadith literature, of course, where Muhammad is like Yoda. He has this almost limitless ability to know what's going to happen in the future. But this is not what we find of the Muhammad in the Qur'an. The people ask thee about the hour. Say thou, the knowledge thereof is but with God. And what can make thee know but the hour may be nigh? God has cursed those who spurn guidance while claiming virtue, al-kafirun. And if you want to know why I translate it that way, you'll have to download my work and look at the first couple of pages of Al-Baqarah, and you'll find all the notes there too. I'm not rehearsing that here. And he has prepared for them an inferno, they abiding eternally therein forever. They will find no ally or helper. The day their faces are tossed about in the fire, they will say, would that we had obeyed God and obeyed the messenger. Now, does this mean following some extraneous literature that the Prophet himself never saw and which contradicts, in many cases, what he is told to say in the Qur'an, in a book which itself claims to be from God, written down at the time, perfect and protected? I mean, if that's really the position that you hold, it may be time to take a long walk and think it over. I'm not trying to sort of push anything on you, but this is a serious business. To continue, and they will say, our Lord, we obeyed our masters and our great men, and they led us astray in the way. Our Lord, give thou them double punishment, and curse thou them with a great curse. That's 33, 62 through 68. So that's how they're going to respond to the people who led them astray on the day of judgment. Again, we find that you will not find to the practice of God, the Sunnah of God, any replacement. Now, what follows are examples relating to those who reject the messenger and indicate that God typically destroys them. And we find this at 35, the first one, 35, 42 through 44. And they swore by God their strongest oaths that if a warner came to them, they would be better guided than any of the communities. I'll just stop there. When we're talking about a warner, again, I must emphasize, the Quranic model is a prophet to come, a messenger to come, to warn usually the elite, typically to be rejected, and then for that community to be destroyed. If you haven't done the homework on that, and just read 7th surah. Just that one surah, and just cut to the bit where it starts. It'll start with the people of Nuh, and it'll just list through. This is exactly the model. And this is the model upon which Muhammad was operating. So I'll start again. And they swore by God their strongest oaths that if a warner came to them, they would be better guided than any of the communities. Then when a warner came to them, it increased them only in aversion, being proud in the land and scheming evil. And the evil scheme surrounds none save its authors. So await they save the practice of the former peoples, the Sunnah of the former peoples. And thou wilt not find in the practice of God any change. This is why I've perceived the ellipsis above, because this is a motif that repeats throughout the Qur'an. And nor wilt thou find to the practice of God any alteration. It's said it twice here. The Sunnah of God does not change, and it's repeated in different words. Have they not travelled in the land and seen how was the final outcome of those who were before them? They were stronger than them in power. And God is not such that anything in the heavens or in the earth should escape him. He is knowing, powerful. That's 35:42 through 44. This is the model. Warning, usually rejection. I mean, there are exceptions. There's the exception in the case of Yunus. But if you read the Qur'an not through the prism of a pre-existing allegiance to a religion that you learnt, but as a book, just set it aside and just read it. The whole narrative is an expectation of destruction based on warning, which ultimately doesn't come, and we'll see as we go forward how that happens and why. Have they not travelled in the land and seen how was the final outcome of those before them? And you see the people in this, just an aside here, the people receiving this revelation, they were steeped in the stories of Ad, Thamud, Fir'aun. They knew these stories. They lived in the lands of the people of Salih and so on. They saw that the destruction. They saw that these places were either empty or just, just covered in desert now. And this is reminding them to continue. They were more numerous than they and stronger in power and impact in the earth. There availed them not that which they earned. When their messengers brought them clear evidence, they exulted at what they had of knowledge, but there surrounded them that whereat they mocked. And when they saw our might, they said, "We believe in God alone and deny that to which we ascribed a partnership." But their faith did not avail them when they saw our might, the practice of God, the Sunnah of God, which had been before concerning his servants, does not change, to continue. And thereupon those who spurned guidance while claiming virtue were lost. That's 82 through 85. The following and final instance in this list is found at 22 through 23. And it relates to a standoff between the believers and, according to the Quranic narrative, is prior to the point where the believers were successful. Again, I repeat, what the messenger's expectation through the majority of the Quran is that he is going to be of the type of messenger who warns and is rejected and is followed by destruction. But there is a point where this shifts, and there is a confirmation of this further later in the Quran, which I shall read after this. So this is 48:22 through 23. And had those who are indifferent to warning fought you, they would have turned and fled. Then would they have found neither ally nor helper. Why? This is as an aside. Why neither ally or helper? Because they would have been destroyed by God, you see. To continue, the practice of God, the Sunnah of God, which had been before, does not change. Continue, and thou wilt not find in the practice of God any change. So that's 48:22 through 23. So the context here relates to the occasion of victory, where Muhammad's message prevailed. And prior to that, he was expecting only destruction. And if you read the Quran, read your favorite translation. It's nothing dependent upon my work. But if you can step back from this expectation of religion and just read it as a book, and you will see that it repeatedly that this is what Muhammad is expecting. He's expecting to be of the type of messenger like Salih, like Nuh, like Lot. This is the template that he's following. However, there are previous examples, or certainly one that comes to my mind, of a messenger who warned, who was successful in his warning, and that's Yunus. So victory is possible. And victory in this case is anticipated at Surah 110. Now, nobody has any way of working out. I had a comment recently about the chronological order of the Qur'an. We have no way of working this out. And looking to a I suppose you could apply a method of reason to work out what came before what, but there's no way of knowing what order things came in. And I personally don't accept the whole idea of Mecca and Medina and surahs, etc., etc. This is a form of dividing the book of God, dividing the Qur'an, something the Qur'an actually warns against. But we can tell, certainly by using an amount of common sense, that certain things certainly came before other things. I haven't looked at this in a huge depth, though. Maybe it's something I could develop in the future. But what is clear is that what I'm going to read now, Surah 110, came before what I've just read, which is at Surah 48. And I'll read the whole of Surah 110. When the help of God and victory come, and thou seest mankind enter the doctrine of God in crowds. And obviously the doctrine of God is not a religion invented hundreds of years later. It's people submitting to God alone. I would remind you that Ibrahim, when he was told by God to submit, he said, "I have submitted to the Lord of the worlds." He didn't say, I've embraced 5 pillars of Islam and I'm a Sunni of the whatever school. No, this is something different. Whatever the Quran means by the doctrine of God, it certainly doesn't mean a religion invented hundreds of years later, and in fact being reinvented. It's not just like it was a one-off event. What we have now, brand Islam, is probably largely unrecognizable. What's being imported into the West, and what a lot of young second generation people from Muslim backgrounds who are embracing a form of so-called radical Islam. This isn't what happened before. These are different these are different narratives. So a bit like democracy, it's something you can just rehash and rehash and rehash, and it's how intelligent men control less intelligent men. So I'll go back to 110. When the help of God and victory come, and thou seest mankind enter the doctrine of God in crowds, give thou glory with the praise of thy Lord, and seek thou forgiveness of him. He is receptive. Now, why give glory and why seek forgiveness? The only reason that makes sense is that confirms the points that I've been making, which is that Muhammad was expecting destruction, and yet God has been receptive. He's ultimately become a messenger of the type of Yunus. It's successful in the sense that people repented, they entered the doctrine of God in crowds. And God has not destroyed the people. Remember too that unlike those previous generations, Muhammad was preaching at Al-Masjid Al-Haram. Now, wherever you place that, I certainly don't think it was in Mecca, but you're welcome to your opinion. Whatever the truth of it, the fact is that people were coming from all around to this place, and this is where Muhammad was warning. So this wasn't just affecting one local community, this was affecting the whole of this, as it were, the local world. So destruction at this point had a far, it's probably, I'm just trying to think, obviously the destruction of the people of Nuh was pretty much total, but since that point I think it would have been the biggest destruction. So we're not just talking about one community or one society. We're talking about an area which was very wide and covered many different groups of people, all of whom for different reasons performed an annual pilgrimage to a particular place. I don't know if most people really consider this, but If you can just for a moment imagine what it's like to carry this trigger in your pocket, that you have a trigger that if you pull this, again, the Sunnah of God does not change. Once you've warned these people, and if they reject, the ensuing destruction. I don't know if you can. I don't think many of us can really imagine the responsibility, that sense of the weight that it is to carry that about. So, in the case of Muhammad, God was merciful, and people entered into the doctrine of God in crowds, and therefore this destruction, which is the Sunnah of God, destruction in the cases in which the messenger is rejected, this was not binding in this particular case. Anyway, I'm going to draw this to a close. If you come from a cultural Muslim background, you will likely have had the concept of Sunnah of the Prophet drummed into you from birth. I would just encourage you, next time you hear Sunnah, just to think of three things. Number one, just remember that the expression Sunnah of the Prophet occurs nowhere in the Qur'an. This is a fact. Number two, where Sunnah occurs in the Qur'an and it relates to former peoples, which it does almost half the time, it typically indicates those communities which were destroyed after rejecting the actual message that the messenger brought. And the third thing is that the destruction of peoples who reject the message of the messenger is the Sunnah of God, and it does not change. That's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Qur'an free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Qur'anite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Qur'an alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.